Be me, Lauren, managing partner at a law firm I helped build from nothing. 38 years old when this whole thing starts. Not a diversity hire, not someone who got handed a title because it looked nice in a brochure. 11 years of actual work got me here. Depositions that ran past midnight. Cases nobody else wanted to touch because they looked impossible. I took them and I won them. That was the whole deal with me. You put a wall in front of me, I find the door. The firm had 4 names on it at the time, mine included. Derek handled corporate work, the kind of lawyer who reads every footnote 3 times and catches the thing everyone else missed. Solid, methodical, the type whose clients called him directly on weekends, and he always picked up. Nate was the litigator you wanted on your side in an actual courtroom. Fast brain, sharp instincts, could take apart a witness on cross before they even understood what was happening. He wasn't polished in the way clients expected when they first met him, but they stopped caring about that after they watched him work. Felix was the glue nobody talks about. Old school, knew everyone in the city, kept client relationships alive for years just by being decent to people. The kind of guy who remembered birthdays and asked about your kids and actually meant it. That stuff sounds small until you realize how many clients stayed with the firm because of exactly that. The 4 of us had built something that genuinely worked. Win rate was high, client list was serious, and referrals came in without us having to chase them. Revenue was solid, the reputation was real, and for a few years everything just ran the way it was supposed to. We weren't perfect, no firm is. There were conversations we didn't have, things that could have been handled differently, moments where someone got talked over in a meeting and nobody addressed it. I noticed those things, and they bothered me. But the work was good, and the team was tight, and I told myself we'd get to the culture stuff eventually. Then a journalist called. She was writing a piece for Forbes about women in law. Asked if she could profile me. I said yes, obviously. The interview was 2 hours. She asked good questions. I told her the truth about how hard it had been coming up in a field that wasn't exactly welcoming, about making partner while being the only woman in certain rooms, about the particular exhaustion of having to be twice as precise as the men around you just to have your arguments taken seriously. The piece came out a few months later. My photo on the page, decent headline, the kind of thing you send to your parents. I read it 3 times that morning, felt proud, genuinely. Not in a vain way, more like the feeling you get when something you actually worked for gets acknowledged in public for the first time. That was the last normal week I can remember. The Forbes thing changed how people talked to me. Suddenly, I was getting invited to panels and conferences I'd never heard of before. Speaking requests, podcast appearances, emails from women at other firms saying the piece meant something to them. I won't pretend it didn't feel good, because it did. There's something about being seen that gets into your head in ways you don't fully notice until later. You start making decisions in the context of the version of yourself that people have decided you are. And that version of yourself has a certain kind of story to tell and a certain direction to go. I went to a conference a few months after the piece came out. 3 days, a hotel ballroom in another city, a lot of talks about workplace culture and equity and what professional firms were getting wrong. I went in thinking I'd network and maybe learn something useful. I came back with a notebook full of ideas and the absolute certainty that I needed to change everything about how we operated. The conference had a whole framework. Accountability structures, recognition circles, values alignment sessions, something called reflective practice that I scribbled 4 pages about. The people presenting it were confident, and the room responded to everything they said. I sat there nodding along and kept thinking about things back home. Derek's habit of dominating the agenda at partner meetings without meaning to. Nate's eye rolls during certain conversations. The way he'd exhale audibly when something took longer than he expected. Felix laughing too hard at jokes that weren't actually funny if you thought about them for 2 seconds. Years of small things I had absorbed and let go because the work was good and I didn't want to make it weird. But sitting in that conference room with 100 other people who had also absorbed and let go of things, it started to feel like the accumulation of all that letting go was itself a problem. By the time I got on the plane home, I had decided we were going to do this properly, not halfway, not as a box to check. Actually do it. First thing I did when I got back was schedule an all-hands. Told everyone we were entering a new phase. Better culture, more intentional environment, structural changes to how we hired and how we operated day to day. The room was mostly quiet in the way rooms get quiet when they're not sure what the information means yet. Derek nodded along in the way he always did when he wasn't sure what to think, but wanted to seem supportive. Nate had his arms crossed but wasn't saying anything, which from Nate was basically the same as a standing ovation. Felix was watching me with this expression I couldn't quite read at the time, something careful in it. Priya was sitting in the front row, taking notes and nodding at basically everything I said. I had hired Priya a few months earlier, specifically to help with this kind of work. She had a background in organizational development and believed in the framework the way you believe in something you've spent years studying. That belief was contagious in a way that felt useful at the time. The first real structural change was the weekly all-hands format. I rebuilt it so the first 15 minutes of every meeting was what I called the recognition circle. The concept was straightforward. Everyone in the room takes a moment to be honest about how their own background, privilege, or position might be affecting the team dynamic. Men were asked to speak first because that was the whole point of it. I had read enough about this kind of work to understand that the discomfort is part of the process. You can't get to real accountability by staying comfortable. That was a thing I believed deeply at the time. Still think there's something true in it, just not the version of it I was running. First recognition circle was bumpy. Derek went when it was his turn and stumbled through something about being aware of how much space he took up in conversations. It was vague, clearly improvised, not particularly deep. I wrote it down in my notebook. I want to be clear about the notebook because people made a lot of it later. The idea was that I was tracking engagement, looking for who was genuinely participating and who was performing. That was a real distinction and worth paying attention to. The notebook was supposed to be the tool for that. In practice, it became something else, but I didn't understand that yet. Felix said something brief about his communication style and moved on. Nate said something that technically checked the box but had this flatness to it, like someone reading a disclaimer out loud. I noticed that and wrote it down. The second week was similar. Derek a little more specific, Felix still brief. Nate with the same quality of disengagement that I kept returning to in my notes. Third week, I introduced the commitment cards. Laminated, one per desk. A short statement about collective responsibility and cultural accountability. We were going to read them out loud together at the end of every meeting. I wrote the language myself over a weekend. I was proud of how they came out. Priya thought they were excellent. Most of the room read along the first time without incident. Nate read it with a voice you'd use for a terms of service agreement. Second week, he was slower, like he was reading a different language. Third week, he put the card face down on the table and looked at the ceiling while everyone else read. I saw it. I wrote it down. Told myself I'd address it in the next spotlight review. Around this time, Felix came to my office and closed the door. He sat down and said he wanted to talk honestly. Not as a partner going over numbers, but as someone who had known me for a long time. I told him to go ahead. He said the recognition circles were producing anxiety rather than reflection. That associates were comparing notes on what to say beforehand. That Derek had mentioned feeling monitored. That the commitment cards were making some people feel like they were being asked to sign something they hadn't agreed to. He laid all of this out calmly. No accusation in it, just information. When he finished, I said, I appreciated him sharing it. And that resistance to this kind of work was a documented phenomenon. That the people most invested in the existing structure staying intact were the ones most likely to frame accountability as an attack. Felix looked at me for a moment and said he wasn't sure that was what was happening here. I said I was sure, not unkindly, just with certainty. He left without saying much more. I filed the conversation under. Felix is struggling with this more than expected. Keep an eye on it. It didn't occur to me to file it anywhere else. He had come to me with genuine concern based on what he was seeing, and I had handed him a framework that made his concern itself evidence of the problem. I didn't understand that at the time. I thought I had handled it well. The Spotlight review was introduced about a month after the commitment cards. The concept was that once a month, one team member would be the subject of an anonymous feedback session. Colleagues submitted written observations about behavior patterns. I compiled them, and we discussed them openly as a group. I thought this was the single most useful structural change I had made. Real feedback, anonymous, so people felt safe being honest, with space for the person being spotlighted to respond and reflect. That was the theory. The first one was a junior associate, went reasonably smoothly, a little uncomfortable, but nothing that felt out of proportion. The second one was Nate. I had chosen him deliberately. I thought he needed to hear certain things, and this was the right format to deliver them. The submissions I received about him were not outrageous. dismissive body language during certain colleagues' contributions, a habit of sighing that created a subtly uncomfortable atmosphere, observed rolling his eyes during team discussions. I read them out to the room at the next all hands. Nate sat and waited until I finished. Then he said, very quietly, that the eye roll had been directed at a spreadsheet error on a slide, that he had literally been looking at a spreadsheet on the screen. I said that his immediate defensive response was actually consistent with what the feedback was describing. That centering his own intent rather than the impact on colleagues was a pattern worth examining. Priya nodded, the room clapped. Nate didn't clap. He was looking at me with an expression I filed at the time as more defensiveness. What I understand now is that it was the expression of someone who has just had a completely factual statement turned into evidence against him and has fully processed what that means for the future. He had understood something I hadn't. I wrote something in the notebook after the meeting. I don't remember exactly what it said. Derek left first. No confrontation, no dramatic exit. I came in one morning and his desk was cleared. There was a short email thanking me for years of good work and wishing the firm well. Nothing hostile, no grievances listed. 3 corporate clients called the same day to say they were following him. I sat with that information for about an hour and then made myself stop sitting with it. Told the team that afternoon that transitions reveal alignment and that the people meant to be part of where we were going would stay. The clients following Derek I rationalized as his personal contacts rather than institutional relationships. If they were attached to one individual rather than the firm itself, they were never really ours in the way that mattered. I told myself that clearly enough that it started to feel true. Priya agreed when I said it to her out loud. That should have told me something about the feedback loop I had created, but it didn't register at the time. Felix came back about 2 weeks after Derek left. He had actual numbers, printed out, annotated, the active caseload with projections on what was at risk. He walked me through the whole thing methodically, the way he approached everything. Current cases that needed senior-level attention we no longer had. Client relationships showing early signs of strain. Output gaps in the associate team that were starting to show up in preparation quality. He laid it out without editorializing, just the data. When he finished, I told him he was experiencing a normal reaction to change, that growing pains looked like crisis from inside them, but resolved with time, that the framework we were building would produce results that weren't visible yet. Felix said he hoped I was right. His voice, when he said it, had something in it I didn't want to look at directly. He left, and I spent the rest of the afternoon reframing what he'd shown me as resistance rather than information. At the next all hands, I didn't use his name, but I talked about how transformation always brought out the people invested in the old structure. That when someone showed up with arguments against the work, it wasn't evidence the work was wrong. It was evidence the work was necessary. Everyone in the room knew who I was describing. Felix knew too. He sat through the whole meeting with his jacket already on. Stood up when it ended, buttoned it, walked out. Didn't come back. His resignation arrived by email that evening. Short, professional, no grievances listed. Same tone as Derek's. I read it, closed the laptop, went home. I won't pretend I felt nothing. Felix and I had known each other a long time, but I told myself that sometimes the people you expect to take the journey with you are only comfortable with the version of you that didn't start asking harder questions. That his departure was about his limitations, not mine. I believed that. Nate stayed longer than I expected. He was still the best litigator we had by a significant margin, and I think I gave him more latitude than I gave the others, because some part of me knew what his output was worth. There was a stretch where things actually felt stable. New associates had settled in, meetings ran the way I wanted them to run, the recognition circles were smooth. I thought the smoothness was progress. What it actually was is that everyone had learned what to say and how to say it. The feedback loop had closed. I was only receiving information that confirmed what I already believed. Priya was filtering the rest. Not maliciously, she genuinely thought she was protecting the work. But the effect was that I was running a firm with a 94% satisfaction score and no idea what was actually happening in the case files. Nate came to my office after a case that had been far harder than it should have been. He had essentially carried it himself because the assigned associates hadn't been able to get the materials together properly. He wasn't upset, just matter of fact. Said he needed 2 specific people brought onto his team, gave me their names, explained their track records. I pulled up what I could find on the names quickly. Both men, similar demographic profile. I told him that wasn't the direction we were building toward, that we had a hiring framework that existed for real reasons and I wasn't going to set it aside. Nate said we had nearly lost that case. I said I understood that and we would find solutions that aligned with our values. He didn't say anything after that, just sat for a second and then left. 2 days later, he was back in the Spotlight review, second time in that seat. The feedback I read out was about resistance to equity-centered hiring and prioritizing personal networks over firm culture. He sat through the whole session. When I finished, he stood up, picked up the commitment card from in front of him, put it down in front of me on the table without any particular ceremony, said he quit, walked out. He took 2 clients with him. Those ones I had a harder time rationalizing, but I tried. The LinkedIn post I wrote that week got more engagement than anything I had ever posted. I wrote about how growth required courage and transformation wasn't painless, and how grateful I was for the season the firm was entering. Thousands of likes, shares, comments from people I had never met. Journalists I respected shared it. I screenshot the notifications and looked at them multiple times. Priya sent me a message that evening saying she was proud to work for me. I went to bed that night feeling like everything was positioned exactly where it was supposed to be. That feeling lasted longer than I deserved it to. The satisfaction survey showed 94% positive. Priya printed it and framed it, actually had it framed, and hung it outside my office. I took a photo and posted it with a caption about what healthy culture looked like in practice. More engagement, more shares. A second interview request came in from a different publication. I agreed to it, and during that interview, I said the proof was in the numbers, that anyone who doubted whether values-led firms could compete had their answer. I believed every word of it when I said it out loud. What I didn't know was that 4 active cases were slowly coming apart. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just the way a small crack spreads before anyone notices the wall is moving. First sign I couldn't explain away was the Harmon account. Long-standing client, had been with the firm since before I was a partner. Felix had originally brought them in. They had a commercial dispute that was supposed to be straightforward, procedural, well-documented, the kind of case we had handled in our sleep a dozen times. We lost it, not because the other side was brilliant, because someone had missed a filing deadline, a basic calendared, non-negotiable procedural date that had been in the system for months. I found out when the client called me directly. Sat in my office after that call and asked Priya to pull the case file. The associate had logged the deadline in the wrong column. Nobody had caught it. Not in review, not in preparation, nowhere in the chain. I called the associate in. She started crying before I finished asking what happened. I sat there watching her and kept having a thought I kept trying not to have. This was not how cases were managed here 2 years ago. I didn't say it. I told her it was a learning opportunity and we would work through it together. She left. I sat at my desk for a while. The Harmon account sent a formal letter the following week. Loss of confidence in the team's capability. Effective immediately, moving their remaining matters to another firm. I read it twice and put it in a drawer. The journalist who wrote the original Forbes piece reached out around that time, said she wanted to do a follow-up, had been speaking with some former employees and wanted to give me a chance to respond to what she was hearing. I said absolutely, come in, I have nothing to hide. She came in, we sat for an hour. I gave her what I thought were good answers. Talked about the transformation, the culture work, the satisfaction data, the direction we were heading. She listened carefully, took notes, thanked me when we were done. I walked her out feeling fine about it, told myself the conversation had gone well. The piece came out a few weeks later. I opened it at my desk in the morning. The headline was not what I expected. Something about the distance between the culture a firm performs and the one it actually runs. I read the first paragraph, and my stomach did something uncomfortable. By the third paragraph, I had put the coffee down. Former associates, unnamed, describing recognition circles as something people rehearsed for, rather than participated in, honestly. Multiple accounts of the notebook and how staff compared notes beforehand on what to say to stay out of it. The commitment cards described as a loyalty oath, in a place where people were scared of the next spotlight review. There was a line about Nate that I read 3 times. About how someone who had been one of the most effective litigators in the room had been labeled a cultural problem for rolling his eyes once and asking a direct question about a hiring decision. There was a line about Derek disappearing one morning because there was no other option that didn't involve public humiliation. There was a line about Felix presenting financial data to his managing partner and being framed as a saboteur at the next all-hands meeting. I read to the end, closed the laptop, opened it again, read it again from the beginning, closed it, sat there. My first reaction was that someone had organized against me, that this was coordinated by people who couldn't handle what we were building and had gone to a reporter to damage it. That was genuinely my first thought, and I held it for a couple of hours. Then a second thought started working its way up that I kept trying to push back down. The notebook. The line about the notebook. She kept a notebook, everyone was afraid of it. I thought about when I had started keeping it and what I had told myself it was for. Pattern recognition, I had said. Tracking genuine engagement versus performance. But when I ran back through what was actually in it, the patterns were all the same. Men not reading the card with enough energy. Men making eye contact with the table during the circle. Men exhaling slightly too loudly. Men asking factual questions about hiring criteria. Derek being vague during his first answer. Felix coming to my office with data. Nate looking at the ceiling. Every entry was about a man not performing the correct version of enthusiasm. I sat with that for a while, and it wasn't comfortable. Priya knocked and asked if I had seen the piece. I said yes. She said the sources were clearly disgruntled, and the framing was unfair. I said, probably. She left. I opened the laptop again and found the section about Felix, the part where someone described him standing up, buttoning his jacket, and walking out after being described as a saboteur in front of the full team. I remembered writing something in the notebook after that meeting. I remembered feeling like the meeting had gone well. The gap between those two memories was doing something to me that I didn't have language for yet. The Glassdoor reviews started within 48 hours of the article. I didn't look for the first day. Priya summarized them, and I told her I'd read them myself. When I finally looked, they were detailed and calm, in a way that was worse than anger. People describing a workplace where actual legal work had become secondary to the performance of values, where junior associates spent more preparation time on recognition circle answers than on case materials, where asking a direct question in a strategy meeting could get you spotlighted the following week. One review said the firm had optimized for agreement over competence, and when those two things conflicted, competence lost. Every time. I didn't respond publicly to any of it. Priya had a draft response ready, but I told her to hold it. I needed to think, and I needed the thinking to not be filtered through someone whose job depended on the thing I was thinking about. The partners' meeting had been scheduled 2 weeks earlier as a routine quarterly check-in. Agenda was standard, financials, pipeline, staffing outlook. I prepared the way I always did, printed materials, structured agenda, a short address at the top about direction. I had written something about resilience, about how the firms that lasted were the ones that didn't flinch when the path got hard, about how criticism from people who opted out of the journey wasn't data, it was noise. I thought the speech was good, walked into the conference room with the materials under my arm, set them at the head of the table, looked up. Priya was there. 4 junior associates who had been hired in the last 8 months were there. Empty chairs where the partners should have been. Not all of them. There were 2 names I hadn't expected to be problems. One had sent an email that morning with a subject line about reconsidering continued participation that I hadn't opened yet. I stood at the head of the table with my printed speech about resilience. Priya said quietly that the Harmon account had called again. I said I knew. The 4 associates were looking at the table or at their phones. Nobody was looking at me. I looked at the commitment card sitting in front of the empty chairs. Laminated, neat, 1 per seat, including the ones with nobody in them. I picked up the one nearest to me, read it through, put it back down. I had built a room where everyone agreed with me. That had been the goal, whether I had been honest about it or not. No eye rolls, no notebooks closing too hard, no Felix with his quiet data and his concerned expressions. Just alignment, the mission, the culture. For a while I had that room, and it had felt like exactly what I was supposed to be building. The problem I was standing in the middle of now was that the room full of agreement had missed a filing deadline, could not hold a cross-examination together without falling apart, had produced a satisfaction score of 94% while losing clients that had been with the firm for over a decade. The agreement was real, the competence was somewhere else. It was across town with Derek, or wherever Nate had gone, or in the institutional memory Felix had taken with him when he buttoned his jacket and left. I stood there with my speech about resilience, looked at Priya, looked at the empty chairs, looked at the laminated cards in front of seats that were not going to be filled today, or probably after this. I didn't give the speech, put the papers down, and sat in my chair instead. The room stayed quiet. One of the associates asked if we were starting. I said, "Give me a minute." Sat there thinking about Derek stumbling through his first recognition circle answer with that expression I had written down as resistance. Thinking about Felix in my office with the printed projections, trying to tell me something real, and how I had handed him a framework that turned his concern into evidence of the problem. Thinking about Nate putting the card down in front of me before he walked out. Not angry, not dramatic, just done. I had won every single argument. Every time someone pushed back, I had a ready response that explained why their pushback was itself the issue. The framework was airtight. That was the thing about it. It was completely sealed and it was completely wrong, and the people who could have gotten through to me clearly enough were gone now. The people left had learned not to say anything that would end up in the notebook. Priya asked again whether we were starting. I told her no, we weren't. Told everyone they could go. They filed out. I sat at the head of an empty conference table with a speech about resilience I was never going to give. Somewhere in the building, a phone was ringing, probably the Harmon account again, or another client, or the journalist with a follow-up, or someone else whose name I had written in a notebook for the wrong reasons. I had walked into that room planning to say the criticism was noise. I left understanding that the reason it was quiet was because I had made it quiet, not through good leadership, by making it clear enough, for long enough, that disagreement had a price. The men who had built the thing I was so proud of managing had looked at that price and concluded it wasn't worth paying, and I had written each of their departures into a notebook as confirmation that I was right about everything. The firm didn't collapse overnight. That's not how it works. There were months of it after that, emergency conversations with clients, a restructuring I won't go into in detail. Some things were salvageable. Most of what had actually mattered wasn't. The reputation takes a long time to rebuild when the people who built it the first time are not coming back. Felix had taken 20 years of relationships with him. Derek had rebuilt a client base that wasn't going to return. Nate was apparently doing well independently. I heard that secondhand and I was genuinely glad for it, even though I had no right to be. I think about the notebook sometimes, not from a comfortable distance, not as someone who has wrapped it up neatly into a lesson, just with the specific discomfort of someone who kept very careful records of every time a man failed to perform the right kind of enthusiasm, and called it accountability, and believed it completely. The part I have the hardest time sitting with isn't that I was wrong about everything, because I wasn't. There were real things that needed addressing before the conference, real dynamics that deserved more attention than they were getting. I wasn't inventing problems from nothing, but somewhere between the Forbes profile and the commitment cards, I stopped trying to fix a culture and started trying to run a room. And running a room perfectly is a very expensive way to be alone. The 94% satisfaction score was real. It just meant that 94% of the people left were either true believers or too scared to say otherwise. And I had no way to tell the difference because I had built a system that made the difference invisible. That's the part that stays with me. Not the clients who left or the cases that went wrong. The fact that I had constructed something airtight enough that I genuinely could not see inside it from where I was standing. That's the whole thing. I still practice law, just not the way I thought I'd be practicing it by now. Some days that's fine, some days it isn't. I stopped keeping a notebook. One thing I didn't mention that I keep coming back to. After Nate's first spotlight review, the one about the spreadsheet, he came to my office later that same afternoon. Just knocked, came in, sat down. Didn't have the aggressive energy I expected. Just said calmly that he wanted to understand the process. Asked specifically what evidence he could provide to demonstrate that the eye roll had been at a slide error and not at a person. I told him the process wasn't about evidence in the legal sense, that the point was to sit with the impact rather than argue about intent. He looked at me for a moment and then asked what the difference was between sitting with an accusation and accepting it as true. I said that was a defensive framing, and that if he could move past the defensiveness, we could have a more productive conversation. He said, "Okay, thanked me for my time," and left. I wrote something in the notebook after he closed the door, logged it as resistant to accountability framing, likely to escalate, Went home that evening and felt like I had handled a difficult situation well. I had given him a fair hearing and maintained the structure. That was what I told myself. What actually happened was that a man had come to me with a reasonable procedural question about how to defend himself in a process I had designed. And I had told him the very act of asking the question was evidence against him. I had closed every exit and written it in a notebook. There's another piece I left out of the earlier part. When Derek's letter arrived and I told the team that transitions reveal alignment, Nate was in the room for that. He didn't say anything at the time, but after the meeting he stopped by my office doorway, didn't come in, just stood there for a second. Said something like, Derek had 40% of our corporate revenue. Not angry about it, just factual in the way he always was about things he thought were being glossed over. I told him that percentage would redistribute as we brought in clients who were aligned with the firm's direction. He stood there for another second and then said he hoped so. Walked away. I thought at the time he was being a pessimist. That was the story I had for Nate, that he was talented but fundamentally pessimistic about change. It made everything he said easier to dismiss. Once you have a story about someone, every piece of data from them goes through that story first. His concern about Derek's clients went through. Nate is resistant to change. His question about the spotlight review process went through. Nate is defensive. His request to hire specific people after nearly losing a case went through. Nate is prioritizing his network over our values. I had built an interpretation of him that made him safe to ignore. And I had done the same thing with Derek and Felix, built stories about each of them that routed everything they said away from information and toward confirmation. The morning the article came out and I read it 3 times. I went through the whole day of meetings that I had scheduled. Because what else do you do? Sat in a client call and said the right things, reviewed a contract draft that needed changes, ate lunch at my desk. By the afternoon I had myself half convinced that Priya was right. Disgruntled former employees, unfair framing, the journalist had an angle going in. Then I went back to my office and just sat. No meeting, no document open, just sitting in a quiet office late in the day. And the thing that kept coming back wasn't the Glassdoor reviews or the clients or the financial situation. It was Felix, specifically the day he came with the numbers. He hadn't come as a critic or an opponent. He had come as someone who had spent years keeping this firm alive through sheer personal investment. He had printed out the projections and brought them to me in good faith, and I had told him his concern was resistance. Then announced to the whole team the next week that a partner had tried to undermine the transformation from inside. Not by name, but everyone knew. Felix knew, and he had sat through the whole meeting, buttoned his jacket, left. No letter until that evening, nothing dramatic. Just gone. I sat in my office thinking about what it takes to absorb that from someone you've known for 15 years and leave without making it worse on the way out. That kind of exit costs something. He had paid it, and I had called it alignment. The day of the partners' meeting, I had gotten dressed like it was any other meeting. Suit I liked, prepared notes, familiar routine, walked in with the same posture I always had. I had given speeches in that room during genuinely difficult periods and gotten through them. This was supposed to be the same. When I saw the empty chairs, I had about 2 seconds where my brain tried to explain them. Traffic, schedule conflicts, someone had the wrong time. Then I looked at the emails I hadn't opened that morning and understood. People had written in advance to say they weren't coming, not because they forgot, because they had decided. I stood there long enough that Priya noticed and said my name. I looked at the framed satisfaction survey on the wall outside through the glass. 94%. I had posted a photo of that thing. I had written a caption about what healthy culture looks like. I had believed it. The distance between that belief and the empty chairs was the whole story, and I was standing inside it. That's really the end of it. No dramatic turning point, no confrontation, no moment where I said the right thing. Just an empty room and a speech I didn't give. The firm kept operating in a reduced form for a while. I stopped the recognition circles about 2 weeks after that meeting. Nobody mentioned it, not even Priya. That silence was its own kind of answer. I practice law. Different context now, smaller scope. Which is fine. I'm good at the actual work, always was. I'm slower to write things down now. Slower to decide I know what something means before I've sat with it. That's about all I have.